Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them to Chief Marketing Officer Confidential. CMO Confidential is a program that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized jobs in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com, here today with my guest, Richard Sanderson. Today's topic, a top executive search perspective on marketing, sales, communications, and the CMO position. Now, Richard started his career at Russell Reynolds, took a detour to work at Booz & Company, went back to Russell Reynolds, and then moved to Spencer Stuart, where he leads the marketing, communications, and sales practice. Spencer is one of the best search firms in the country, and Richard specializes in CMO, CRO, CCO, and sales leadership positions, all the C's, and he leads 25 searches per year on average and sees a lot more. Full disclosure, I've known Richard for several years as he recruited me to the Allworth Financial Board. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
All right, Richard, let's start. Give us a quick overview of the talent marketplace and what you are seeing today.
Yeah, okay. So it's been an interesting, let's call it 3 years. Let us take us back, I guess, to the beginning of the pandemic, if that works for you, Mike. From
that does. I mean, between we have COVID, we have quiet quitting, we have all this stuff, all in the remote work, all in the last 3 years. Give us the landscape that you see.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So I'll take it back just 3.5 years. I won't go back any further than that. But it's this sort of pandemic and post-pandemic period, because it's been a remarkable roller coaster ride, I think, over the last 3.5 years. I'd probably break this into 3 or 4 distinct phases that we have seen. Phase one was the immediate aftermath of when the pandemic hit. So that first, let's call it 3 to 6 months. So that is March 2020 through until the summer of 2020. And look, there was a sharp decline in the employment market, particularly in the executive search market. There was a sudden drop as there was some uncertainty. If you remember, it's hard to believe this. We were all locked up at home. No one was going anywhere. I mean, it was just crazy times. Phase two, I would say, was from that summer of 2020 onwards through, and that I would say this phase lasted about a year and a half or so, through until mid 2022. And that's when we saw a big spike in hiring in the employment market, a big adjustment, really became a seller's market for talent at this point. I'd break this phase two perhaps into phase 2A and 2B. There was the initial period where we were all leaning into buying products for our homes and our kitchens, and where we were spending time, our gardens and all that kind of stuff. So things like consumer durables, products, and those types of companies did really well. Then I'd say there's phase 2B, where there was a big rotation. We started coming out of our shelves again. There was a big spike in more service-related activities. So we saw a big spike in things like leisure, hospitality, travel coming back really quickly, almost at the expense of product and product-related businesses. So you saw that rotation within phase two. Then I'd say a phase three crept in, which was late 2022. So somewhere around mid this year. So this coincided with a spike in inflation, a rise in interest rates to where they are about now. And I think for the first time, we saw what I might call a little bit of a white collar recession took place. We saw companies that have never really had hiring freezes or reductions in force in their history start having them. So
all the tech companies, the recalibration of everybody's valuation in both health, biotech, and just raw tech, and a lot of startups. That was quite a change.
It was. So there's a few things. There's actually some very interesting sub-trends buried going on underneath that. So first of all, I would say you're right. We saw, I think Mark Zuckerberg is calling 2023 the year of efficiency. I think is the phrase he's out there with. But
Always catchy, efficiency.
What it's meant is, we have seen these, particularly, you called it out, of West Coast, particularly consumer or digital tech companies, really look at large scale layoffs for the first time, hiring freezes. This coincided with the rise of interest rates and just as a sense of looking much more closely at the cost base. And so the paradox here, or the irony, is on the one hand, I think the employment numbers that come out from the Department of Labor have suggested actually employment is at all-time highs and the unemployment level is at an all-time low. What's actually going on beneath the surface is there's a little bit of a white-collar recession going on. And that, perhaps the service sector or hourly jobs, there's more of those available than people to fill them. On the other hand, we saw at the top end of the market where search firms focus, there was a pullback. And I whilst I've not studied the publicly released financial results of the publicly traded search firms, I think the general experience in executive search is that 2023 is going to be a down year.
Yeah,
we're seeing. I think what's going to happen is we will look back at 2021 and 2022 as years of overhiring. We will probably look at 2023 as, if you like, a reversion to the mean. And my guess is, and then this is now phase 4 that we're in, I've noticed, for me, it was really around May, I noticed a real sentiment shift to the positive. I think we're looking at a return to normalcy in second half of 2023 and now going into 2024.
So if we get back to normal, if we're returning to normal, is something like AI or quiet quitting or, the lazy girl thing, is that going to is that really a real thing, or what are you seeing from the search seat on all this stuff going on? Is that coming back to normal too, or are those real trends and all the fighting about remote work and coming back to the office and real estate?
Right. Okay, so you've actually packaged up quite a few things there, Mike.
I did. I'm going to let you go wherever you want with them.
Which I'm just going to break down into some sub-bits. So there's a whole discussion right now about AI, metaverse, what impact is that going to have on marketing and marketing leadership? And I'm just going to put that off to the side for a moment, because there's that's a whole separate discussion we could have. You brought up issues around quiet quitting, or the quote unquote, the great resignation. I think it was called once upon a time. And then there was a third issue in there, which is the return to office.
Right.
These are all major, substantial issues right now that we're having a lot of discussions with our clients about. So let me sort of take this of quiet quitting or great resignation, call it whatever you want. I actually thought about it more of a great reshuffle than necessarily a great resignation. I'm not sure that if you look at labor employment trends or labor participation rates, you saw a massive change necessarily.
It sure doesn't look like it when you look at the U.S. numbers.
So I'm not necessarily sure people were like quitting in vast numbers, but rather sort of rethinking certain decisions for a period of time and certain trade-offs they were willing to make. I think it also reflected, to be honest, what was going on was there have been very different experiences over the last 3 years, depending where you are in your career. And so here's what I mean by this. The reality is for senior leaders, some of them did really well in the last 3 years. You pointed out yourself, off the initial dip in March 2020, share prices rocketed. I mean, from what I remember, the Dow Jones dipped below 20,000 in March 2020, but it soared to over 36,000 by 2021. And if you're in a tech company, you actually experienced unprecedented wealth creation in a short period of time. And specifically, the NASDAQ went below 7,000 in March 2000 and then hit 16,000 by Thanksgiving of the following year. I mean, there was the level of volatility was extraordinary. And if you timed it right, you made a boatload of money. Now, not everyone times it right. But so for senior leaders, some of them are having the best times of their lives. And by the way, they didn't have to be in the office. And it's not polite to say it, but some of them were having a grand old time. Now, on the other hand, I think if you were early or mid-career, I think it was a very different experience. The pandemic was often deeply traumatic. It often meant moving back with your parents. You might have been leaving big cities. There's a huge amount of uncertainty in professional and personal lives. And you saw much greater turnover in that cohort. And their experience of work was very different. In many cases, there was no coaching going on, no mentoring, no real development. And so when people talk about quiet quitting, what I think was actually happening is people were leaving mediocre jobs with poor company cultures. That's what was really going on. But very vastly, and I don't think people talk about this enough, there was vastly different experiences, I think, of the last 3 years, depending where you were in your career.
I think this is a great insight into what's really happening, and also the fact that you shouldn't paint this with a broad brush, but you should look at talent and careers like you would look at a consumer segmentation.
Absolutely.
And think about it that way. I want to flip this over to the CMO, CRO, and all the other C searches you do, because you do so many C searches. And I want to talk about what are you seeing here between, as companies are rethinking all of this, marketing, sales, comms, and customer experience. Those used to be all kind of single jobs, and now they're kind of mashing up. Maybe. What do you see there?
It's all over the place, Mike. I mean, first of all, let me start with a statistic that sometimes shocks people around the presence of the chief marketing officer. If you look at the Fortune 500, and we've done many studies, and some of them we'll quote, I'm sure, later during this discussion today.
Absolutely.
It's somewhere around, I think, 27% of Fortune 500 companies don't even have a chief marketing officer, which is sometimes people go, what, really? It's a bit of a shocking statistic. Compare that to, I think, 0% of companies that don't have a chief financial officer.
Yeah, amazing. CIO. Yeah.
Right. Now, here's the important thing to say. It's not to say these companies don't have marketing, the ones that don't have a CMO. They probably have marketing, but it's probably either in a regional role, a divisional role, a business unit role. It's just not necessarily elevated to the enterprise level within a company where it necessarily has a voice at the table, or it may just be a reflection of how a company is structured. Warren Buffett, for example, has no use for a chief marketing officer, but his single largest operating unit, which I think is Geico, absolutely has a chief marketing officer. So, it first of all depends on how do we define CMO? Does it matter if it exists at the enterprise level or not? But the stat number one is over 25% of companies don't even have a chief marketing officer. What there has been a significant evolution over the role. I think the big trend has been the merging of some aspects of what have been traditionally called sales and what's been traditionally called marketing. I think, again, in the pandemic, one of the immediate impacts was yet another wave of not so much digital transformation, but digital acceleration. And we saw some of the traditional roles or boundaries between sales and marketing just disappear. The concept of having a field sales organization at the outset of the pandemic was laughable because they couldn't be in the field. Yeah. And so, you saw another opportunity for marketing leaders to have substantial impact on revenue and sales, which is, even though I know there's a lot of naysayers out there about marketing, I'm actually convinced we're in the quote unquote the golden age of marketing, as there's more opportunity now than ever before for marketers to have revenue impact. But back to your question about what's happening to the role, this evolution is nothing new. I mean, I remember 10 plus years ago when people were talking about, what is this chief growth officer role that is cropping up in consumer products companies? And there are a range of large scale multinational CPG companies that moved to a chief growth officer structure where a marketing leader was actually a report into a chief growth officer. So there's a question around, oh my goodness, the CMO role is being layered. What does that mean? It's the end of the CMO role. Of course it wasn't, but just another iteration. We're seeing it now again, but crop up in different ways. I'll point to, for example, the retail sector. I think I can say this, I think it's true, most retailers of scale now have a chief customer officer.
Yeah. And your role, a lot of people are rolling customer experience and other stuff into that job versus just the marketing.
Correct.
Makes a lot of sense.
Right. And so what does that mean for marketing leaders? Look at some businesses that have a chief customer officer, they don't have a CMO. In many cases, you could say somewhat cynically, the chief customer officer is just a CMO plus role, right? Which, by the way, I regard as a good thing. And when you look at the definition, when you look at job description, we have the pleasure of writing a lot of job descriptions and talking to our clients about scope of role and responsibilities. I mean, you'll see in these chief customer officer descriptions, there's a lot of table stakes marketing stuff that's in there. So, typically all branding creative is in there, insights, analytics, digital. I think where the chief customer officer role really does get differentiated is around ownership of the omni-channel experience activation. Fundamentally, it's about how do you link physical and digital assets. Consumers do not go on some linear path as to how they choose to shop. They migrate and move across multiple channels, but traditional company org structures, frankly, aren't set up well to match how the consumer chooses to shop. And essentially, the chief customer officer, I think, is an attempt to address those types of journeys, but also throwing in the next wave. We're seeing retail media, essentially the monetization of data that exists, media networks that are growing up within retailers, the important role of believe it or not, they don't talk about this much, but financial services or credit cards. For some,
absolutely, that's a huge.
Yeah, I mean, they don't talk about this, but sometimes you could rather cynically argue that a retailer is actually a rather large credit card program that happens to have some retail stores attached to it, because when you look at where the net income comes from, it's disproportionately from financial services activities associated with the retail experience. Some of that is being thrown in with the chief customer officer. Plus,
and I think I will say I look at it as a really good thing, because to me it's a CMO plussed up job.
Right.
And I look at that was like my job at a couple of the companies where you had customer experience or the call centers and the service groups in there, which is you're really the customer interface versus, and marketing is one piece of that, but not all of it.
Right.
Can I flip the question a little bit and say, all right, so we have a bunch of companies that don't have a CMO, they have all those other things, they have this. When you look at the CMO job, a lot of people get it right, and a bunch of people maybe get it wrong. What's the biggest mistake people are making now when they structure the CMO job or hire CMOs that you see?
Okay, really good question. I think there's a number of issues that still are not well addressed when it comes to hiring chief marketing officers. Number one is inconsistent definition of what the role is and what the expectations are. I will, when we're taking a brief for a chief marketing officer search, depending who the hiring manager is, it might be the CEO, it might be someone else. But I'll often ask them, how will you know if your chief marketing officer hire is successful after year one? And just leave it there. And there's often a very awkward pause. And then I get a really fluffy answer. I mean, and this is my point. I don't think there's a consistent definition of what marketing is, or more importantly, what does success in marketing actually look like? There are no consistent success metrics. Now, I don't want to make this all about the fault of the client. It's not. I think if there's fault to be pinned potentially on marketing leaders, I encourage them, you've got to not just think like a marketer, you've got to think like a business leader. How often as a chief marketing officer do you talk to your CFO or your CEO about the impact your marketing budget will have on earnings per share? Are you talking to them about their language? I don't think CEOs, CFOs, frankly, give a damn about impressions, eyeballs.
And they shouldn't, right? They got to manage investors.
Right. The sort of stuff that marketers worry about, you can almost, hear the air coming out of the balloon, perhaps, of CEOs and CFOs when marketers might engage on those types of metrics. So I think there's this sense of, what does success look like in the role? That's a challenge, inconsistent definition. I would also say the role has become really hard. It is now a really, really broad role. I think my concern is marketing has become a really broad church. I think a successful marketer is expected to be everything from a brand visionary, a creative genius, a product marketing expert, through to being a guru on data science, marketing technology, lifecycle marketing. I mean, the list of what a marketing leader is expected to be an expert on has just become enormous and out of control.
And we have had a couple shows on this where one is the CMO job headed for extinction because of exactly this, because somewhere in there you're going to have some negative numbers. And if people are after you, you're pretty easy to blame. We've also had two shows. One, we've had a couple along this. One, a CEO who was a marketer who said, look, if the board and the CEO don't believe in marketing, you probably shouldn't take the job. And then we had a business professor from Virginia say, throw away the job spec because it might be okay for the CEO, it might be okay for you, but it's probably not okay for the company. You have to go through the interview process and figure out, is this job spec real and how are they really going to judge you? And you should probably write your own, because just because the CEO or the head of HR has this job spec doesn't mean your peers will have it. and you want to scope this out before you go in. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a fundamental question. If you're a candidate looking at a marketing role, and by the way, not just CMO, for any
marketing
role.
role,
I mean,
right.
I think there is a question you need to very critically ask yourself around, does this company, quote unquote, get marketing? Are they actually serious about it? Is the marketing, how much strategic and commercial impact is the marketing role or the marketing leadership team allowed to have on this business? And we just have to face some realities, which is the role that marketing plays in businesses and the impact it has does vary. I would say in consumer products companies, marketing is typically the sun around which the other stars revolve, and the route to the top is typically through marketing. That's where the P&L ownership resides, and that is the route to the top. In other businesses, you have to accept that is not the case, and marketing exists in service to other functions. Where wires get crossed is when a company says one thing, but actually believes something else. And this is what I encourage,
which happens. I will just say, we get a lot of calls in, and that happens so much. And if you ask the wrong questions in the interview, you won't see it coming, and you'll get there and you're going to get struck by the bus.
I agree. And look, people aren't doing this from any malicious intent. I just want to be very clear. I do think that business leaders and whoever it may be, when they say the right things about marketing, I really do believe they mean it. I also recognize there can be quarterly earnings, results, pressures, budgetary pressures, and more often than not, marketing can be the first one to get it in the neck. And so what I often encourage people to think about is not only can companies talk the talk, but will they walk the walk about the commitment to marketing, but also just going into this with your eyes wide open. I mean, just how much permission or influence is marketing able and want to have, and not trying to overstate that or understate that, but just an acceptance of, look, this is how much impact it can have.
Look, I think this is super important because, look, that's like everybody wants to get in shape, but getting in shape takes a lot of effort. Like everyone wants a great brand and a great marketing department and great CAC and great web. You want it all, but you have to be willing to do what it is. I have a couple questions I ask when I'm looking at jobs, but do you have any recommendations for what people should ask to see if marketing is really has the influence and like power to go with the responsibility it's given? Because you know all this stuff, make magic, but then if you have nothing to do with, how do you?
I'll give you a couple of tips. So number one, if it's a publicly traded business, here's what I actually do, and this is when I do my own research on a company, but it's very telling. Go to the 10K, and on your computer, or whatever it is, do Control F where you search for a word. Type in the word marketing. See how many times it's mentioned in the 10K.
Oh, that's a good one.
If it's like not mentioned at all, if there's like no mention of marketing at all in the 10K, I think you know what you're walking into. So that's tip number one. Just see, does the company talk about marketing in their public filings? That gives you a sense, number one, of how seriously the company takes it. I'm not saying there's a threshold for the number of times it needs to be mentioned, but it gives you a flavor for, is this a topic the company wants to discuss publicly, yes or no? Topic number two would be, particularly when you get towards the end of a process, it's telling how many people you've been allowed to speak to and how broad that audience is. Because here's the lens, I think, through which you should be looking at it. How well does the broader business leadership, beyond just the hiring manager, how actively are they engaging in marketing? Is this on their agenda? Do they want to talk to you about it? How broad was the process coming in? I'm not looking to expand an interview process so it's out of control, but at least try and have a sense of, is marketing on the agenda of other key business leaders, yes or no? And I think you can only get to that by trying to have an interview or a discussion before you are offered a job or before you accept a job. So trying to do as much due diligence as you can, because it is really hard. And then the third thing I say to people is, look, make LinkedIn your friend. Go and find people who've left this company in the last 6 or 12 months and look them up and try and engage with them and just ask them, what is the culture like in the firm? What is the role, impact, influence this team has? How is the leader, the marketing leader, viewed by their peers? Try and do your own due diligence as much as you can, and a great way to do that is by tracking down people who've left the company in the last 6 or 12 months.
I think those are super tips. I will add 2 questions that I've used, which is, who has final approval of creative and media? And if it's not me, I'm probably not taking that job because I don't have any of the authority that goes with the responsibility. And then the second question I always ask is, if I want to move money across my functions, I should be able to do that. If I have to get someone else's approval, I'm not really running whatever my span of control is. And so those are the 2 questions that I've used as kind of really important insights as to how the decisions get made. Hey, so I still think the CMO job, as we kind of have alluded to, is still, I think, the fastest turning job in the C-suite. What would you tell everybody? Well, one, if that's not true in your mind, you should let me know. And then 2, even if it isn't the fastest turning job, and I think a couple of people still think it is, or a lot of people do, what should people be doing to extend their tenure right now?
Okay. All right. This is a really important topic, Mike, because I am pushing back hard on this narrative that somehow CMOs are a bunch of failures and that somehow they've got 2 or 3 years to prove themselves or they're out. It's just not true. And I know there have been some very high profile articles written in very well established and prestigious publications that talk about this. And you know what? When we've looked at the data, it just doesn't support it. So here's what I mean by this. So at Spencer Stuart, we look at the Fortune 500 and we look at all functional leaders, not just the marketing leader, but we've done a tenure study on every single marketing leader in the Fortune 500. Now, for 20 years, Spencer Stuart has published an average CMO tenure study. In full disclosure and candor, we did change the data set about 2 years ago. Historically, we had relied on the Ad Age 100, so the top 100 advertising spenders as measured by their marketing spend. What that meant was it was an inevitable lean into more consumer-driven categories and high spenders, and also limited to just 100. In the last 2 years, we switched to the Fortune 500. By definition, the sample size is 5 times bigger, and it's a much broader array of companies and a much more of a blend of B2B and B2C, as opposed to just high-profile, high-spending brands or businesses. So I think we feel a lot more robust. So let me just give you the headline. So the average tenure of a chief marketing officer, when you look at the Fortune 500, is 4.2 years. The average tenure of the C-suite as a whole is 4.4 years. It's really not that different.
No, that would be a standard deviation. So
correct. And if you look at, so I'll give you some of the others, the chief financial officer, 4.6 years. The chief HR officer, 4.5 years. The general counsel is high, 5.5 years. Supply chain officer, 4.3 years. Marketing, 4.2. It's just not that different. And so we are trying to move away.
A standard deviation, other than
we're trying to move away from this. As I said, there's this narrative out there that CMOs are failures, they turn over. So then we went even further and said, okay, well, I don't think many people have answered the question, what happens to CMOs when they do leave their job? I mean, are they actually being fired or what goes on? And here's the punchline. No, they're not. The punchline is this, and this data has just been updated. We've not published this anywhere yet, Mike, so I'm glad to give you the exclusive on this.
CMO Confidential has got a scoop.
You've got a scoop here. So we have looked at the Fortune 500. We've looked at every CMO that exited their role between 2019 and 2022. In total, that's over 250 CMOs who've exited their role. Of those, 68% of exiting CMOs are either promoted within their own company or go on to a similar or bigger role at another company. That means that approximately 31%, and I'll break it out to you in more detail. So fundamentally, 17% of CMOs, when they leave their role, that's 1/7, are genuinely retiring. They've come to the end of their career. 15% are either self-employed or don't have a current role. So that means, okay, they might have been fired, they might have left involuntarily, something else has happened. But the vast majority, Mike, are going on to bigger and better roles. And so this sense that somehow they're failures and being fired after 3 years, it's just not true.
I love that you prepared for this, because we may have to have you back and put all these charts up and talk about it. Because I know when I talk to the academics about this, they will say they're looking at thousands of companies. And if you go past the 500 and you go deeper, the turnover is pretty harsh. But
yeah, and I would say, look, that may be driven by other events. I mean, the moment you step outside of the Fortune 500, you start getting into companies that, they may be private, private equity owned. I mean, they're on very defined timelines of buying a company, exiting a company, and that may result in a change of a leadership team. And yes, I accept that this data I'm giving you is the largest 500. This is more of a large cap view. And I've no doubt, yes, if you do go to smaller companies, it may look a little bit different, but we deliberately expanded from 100 to 500 companies to try and give this some robustness. But as I said, this sense that CMOs are failures is just not true. I view it like this. The CMO role is really a platform role onto something else in your career. CMO is not necessarily an end destination, but a waypoint onto something else in your career. And this is the sort of the narrative that the data supports, not that CMOs are failures and can't hack it and constantly in this revolving door. That's just not true.
Well, this was super helpful, and thank you for the preparation on this. I want to flip I want to, because we may have to have you back on the show if you're willing, to talk about this later on. If people are out there listening to the show and they want to be a CMO, and they're down at that director level or up, what would you advise them to be doing now to get ready for this kind of job, given all the stuff we've talked about and how much there is to learn and do, and how the job's getting harder and harder? What should they be doing now?
Right. So you need to find either a manager or a leader or a company that's going to develop you. And what I mean by that is, I hinted earlier that my concern about marketing is it's become now a series of highly specialized swim lanes, and you sort of grow up in a swim lane, and if you're not careful, you get painted with a brush that goes, that's the creative person. Or
look, you can only do the backstroke, but you have to do the you have to do the medley.
Or that's the quant jock. That's our acquisition, customer acquisition person. How do you find a business or a manager that will rotate you through different roles and give you different experiences early in your career? I mean, I will often challenge some marketing leads and say, hey, when was the last time you put your creative director and made them a director of performance marketing? They don't do it. But increasingly, I think, with these wide, broad encompassing job specs that are coming up, I mean, there is some expectation that you have touched different parts or most parts of the marketing skill set or most parts of the business. So how do you find someone or something that will invest in you? And so it also means that the places where people maybe used to go and think about starting their careers are not necessarily exclusively the places I would encourage people to go now.
You mean you're like saying like a Procter and a Pepsi?
I don't want to pick on those, because those continue to be absolute academy companies that generate a disproportionate amount of CMOs. But it is true, I think, that if you're in Procter & Gamble, you're not really being exposed to many direct business models. You are still selling your product in an intermediated way, I mean through retail, to get your end consumer. The direct-to-consumer business model is not yet, I don't believe, a substantial part of their revenue. And yet, of course, the last 10 years has seen a wave of these companies. Now, whether this wave of companies is here to last is a whole other question. Many of them have unsustainable business models. Many of them have been unprofitable. Many of them, in the most cynical sense, you could say, have been propped up by private equity money that kept them in business and just eroded the margins of every other business. If you want to be really cynical, you could say that. But I'd also say, this direct-to-consumer business model is clearly here to stay. And
without a doubt. I mean, if you just look at Progressive and Geico and insurance, that's like a massive industry shift.
And this isn't just about a B2C. I mean, in the B2B world, which we haven't spoken much about that, I think some of the most interesting transformations and upgrades of marketing leadership are happening in B2B businesses. If you think about the role that lead generation plays there and the role that marketing plays in lead management now in B2B, that is significant and substantial. And so there's a whole set of skill sets that exist out there that you don't necessarily get through just the academy companies of the past. They're still very important, and they develop great leadership and general management capabilities as well, which matters just as much at a senior level as the individual, technical capabilities. But this is more about finding a leader, a manager, a mentor, a business that is willing to invest and give you exposure to different development areas. I've always felt that companies, I'll pick on a few companies. American Express has done a great job, I think, of developing talent across different. I realize they're essentially a monoline financial services credit card business, essentially at its heart, but do a great job of developing talent. If you look at resumes of people in American Express, they're constantly changing jobs every 2 years.
Right.
And that's not viewed as a weakness. I think that's viewed as a strength. And there are other businesses like that that have done a really good job of developing talent, and they exist in industries or places that you might not expect. Financial services is actually, I might say, Mike, 20 years ago, financial services was not a place a great marketing person went to go and have a standout.
No, but
career.
now it is.
Now it is. And some of the work being done by insurance companies that you mentioned or credit card businesses is very cutting edge. And
because now you have all the data.
I know.
All the data and a way to use it directly.
And so this comes to another point around, is the future of marketing about who owns first-party data? And what is that going to mean for the future? Anyway, that's maybe for a future podcast, Mike.
Well, I hear you agreeing to come back. And I want to summarize what you just said, because we're running up against time and I want to get the last question in here. But what I heard you say here is, look, get trained by someone that knows what they're doing. 2, get broad as much as possible so that you are doing more things. And then 3, think like a general manager, not like a marketer, no matter where you are in this space, so that you are learning as much as you can. Is that a fair summary of what you kind of said?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So last question. Practical advice and or funniest story you want to share with our listeners that we haven't talked about today. You can take one or both of those, but you must take one. Practical advice and or funniest story.
Okay, practical advice, because I don't have a great funny story for you off the top of my head, but practical advice is what has become clear to me for doing this job now for almost 20 years is that the most important thing someone possesses in their career is their reputation. How you treat people, how you engage with people, how you manage people, the feelings you leave with people, that is the most important thing you have in your career. When we do a lot of what we'll call sort of backdoor referencing, third-party sourcing on people before we even make the call to them. And a lot of it is often dwelling, it really comes down to, what is this person's reputation? What have they done? What are they like? I say this because your reputation is the hardest thing for you to adjust. You can't just pivot your reputation overnight. It is the accumulated experience of often decades of how you treat and how you engage people. So I would say at any point in your career, the most important thing you can do is treat people well, be treated well, treat people the way you would expect to be treated. And you don't have to actively cultivate your reputation. I'm not saying that, but think about how you engage with people, because that is a track record that goes with you. You can't adjust it easily. And that is often, what will be the lingering impression you leave on people and how they talk about you to others, particularly people like us.
Well, I think that is a great finish to the show. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Richard, and thanks to everyone for listening to CMO Confidential. Look for our other shows on Evergreen, Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, which include Why Marketing and IT Should Be BFFs. A leading business thinker and futurist talks about what's next. Is the CMO position headed for extinction? And what private equity really thinks about marketing. Hey, all you marketers, stay safe out there. This is Mike Linton signing off for CMO Confidential.
Today's episode of CMO Confidential is brought to you by CMOcoaches.com. Are you a current or aspiring chief marketing officer looking to take your career to the next level? You should work with a CMO coach. CMO coaches are former CMOs who are nationally certified coaches. So whether you want to improve your leadership skills, develop your team, or drive better business results, we have the experience and expertise to help you succeed. To learn more, visit us at CMOcoaches.com.
Are you tired of the same old productivity hacks? Have you read the top 20 books on effectiveness, and yet your workdays and email inbox still causing anxiety, burnout, and even depression? Ready to learn the latest in brain-based modalities, techniques, and technologies to optimize your success and well-being? Welcome to the Focus to Evolve podcast, where we'll illuminate your path to spacious productivity and balanced thriving. Each week, we dive into deeply insightful and immediately impactful methods to help you become highly effective while promoting health, profitability, and well-being. Say goodbye to the trance of busyness and hello to your highest potential. It's time to discover a new way of accelerating your mission, growth, and purpose. Join us on the Focus to Evolve podcast and get ready to live your most joyful, productive, and fulfilling life.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about my podcast called Can I Offer You Some Feedback? I'm a business consultant and executive coach with over 20 years experience in change management, leadership development, and naturally providing feedback to high performers. My podcast is for those of you who have a complicated relationship with feedback, whether giving, receiving, avoiding, or seeking. Feedback is essential for our development. In each episode, you'll hear from real people across industries with their ideas, perspectives, and best practices on feedback. I'll also be sharing business bites with you, simple explanations of organizational tools, management techniques, and leadership philosophies that will help you and your businesses thrive. You can listen to Can I Offer You Some Feedback on your favorite podcast app, or learn more at evergreenpodcasts.com.